White couple gave away black girl at birth, cry when she saves their lives. 30 years later. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. Every word I speak from love. But today my heart feels heavy. Why do I have to keep asking you to like and comment? If you truly feel this bond, if I still matter in your heart, show it. Say, I am here. Click like. Your silence hurts more than you know. I'm not here for numbers. I'm here for you. And if you're still with me, prove it. Not because I begged, but because love responds, even in silence. Climate change is real. Our world is bleeding. So I made a vow. Every new subscriber means one tree planted, a promise of life, a gift of hope. But I can't do this alone. Here's my prayer for your soul. May love call you to act. May your silence break into kindness. May the world feel lighter because you chose to care today. Let's begin. With truth, with love, and with courage. The winter wind howled against the windows of the tiny trailer like a wounded animal, and 20-year-old Roger Hudson felt his heart breaking as he watched his 19-year-old wife, Jody Perrin, struggle with contractions that racked her small. The frame. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls of their cramped home, candles they'd lit not for romance, but because the electricity had been shut off 3 days ago. Roger, Jody gasped between waves of pain, her fingers digging into his calloused hands so hard her knuckles turned white. I'm scared. I'm so scared. I'm here, baby, he whispered, his voice breaking as he smoothed her sweat-dampened hair away from her face. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere, not ever. But even as he spoke those words, Roger felt the weight of their reality crushing down on him like a physical force. They had exactly $47 to their names. $47 between them and the world, between them and the life growing inside the woman he loved more than his own breath. He'd been working 3 jobs, construction during the day, stocking shelves at night, and weekend shifts at the gas station. But it still wasn't enough. It was never enough. The pain in Jody's eyes wasn't just physical. Roger could see the shame there, the guilt that had been eating her alive for months. She'd told him the truth about the baby's father 3 months into her pregnancy, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. A night of terrible judgment, a moment of weakness when she'd been drinking away her sorrows after her mother's funeral, a man whose name she didn't even remember. Roger, what if you can't love her? Jody had whispered that night, her hand protective over her growing belly. What if you look at her and see him? What if you see my mistake? Roger had taken her face in his hands then, just as he did now, and looked into her eyes with such fierce love that it took her breath away. Jody Marie Perrin, you listen to me. This baby isn't a mistake. This baby is a miracle. She's part of you, which means she's part of me, and I will love her with every beat of my heart until the day I die. Now, as another contraction ripped through Jody's body, Roger felt that promise burning in his chest like a sacred oath. When the ambulance finally arrived, their neighbor Mrs. Chen had called when she heard Jody's screams. Roger held his wife's hand in the back of that vehicle, whispering prayers to a God he'd only recently started believing in. Please, he prayed silently, watching Jody's face contort with pain. Please let them both be okay. I'll do anything. I'll work harder. I'll be better. Just please, let them both be okay. At Mercy General Hospital, Roger paced the waiting room floor, his work boots squeaking against the linoleum. Every few minutes, a nurse would emerge with updates, but the words seemed to drift past him like smoke. All he could think about was Jody, alone in that delivery room, bringing their daughter into an uncertain world. When the doctor finally emerged, her face was grave. Mr. Hudson, your wife and daughter are alive, but we need to talk. Roger's legs nearly gave out beneath him. What's wrong? What's wrong with them? Your wife is fine, exhausted but fine. Your daughter. The doctor paused, choosing her words. Then carefully. She was born with a congenital heart defect called hypoplastic left heart syndrome. It's serious, Mr. Hudson. Without immediate surgery, she won't survive more than a few weeks." The world tilted sideways. Roger grabbed the back of a chair to keep from falling. Surgery? What kind of surgery? A series of 3 surgeries, actually. The first needs to happen within the next 72 hours. The total cost. She hesitated. The total cost will be approximately $200,000. $200,000. The number echoed in Roger's head like a death knell. He made $8 an hour at his best-paying job. $200,000 might as well have been $2 million. "Can I see them?" he whispered. In the NICU, Roger stood frozen at the sight of his daughter. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, tiny and perfect, with skin the color of warm honey and a head full of dark curls. Tubes and wires seemed to engulf her tiny body, but her eyes, when they fluttered open, were the deepest brown he'd ever seen, filled with a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so small. "She looks like an angel," Jody whispered from a wheelchair beside him. She'd insisted on coming to see their daughter, despite the doctor's protests. "Our angel." Roger reached through the opening in the incubator and gently touched one tiny finger. The baby's hand immediately closed around his finger with surprising strength, and Roger felt his heart expand so much he thought it might burst. "Hey there, princess," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "I'm your daddy, and that beautiful woman there, that's your mama. We love you so much already." For the next 3 days, Roger and Jody lived at the hospital. They took turns holding their daughter when the nurses allowed it, sang to her, told her stories about the life they were going to build together. Roger had never been much of a singer, but he found himself humming lullabies his own mother had sung to him years ago. But with each passing hour, their daughter's condition grew more critical. The doctors pressed them for a decision about the surgery, about payment plans, about options they simply didn't have. On the 3rd night, as Roger sat in the chapel with his head in his hands, a nurse named Margaret sat down beside him. She was an older woman with kind eyes and hands that had clearly held many grieving parents. "You know," she said softly, "in my 30 years here, I've seen a lot of families face impossible choices. Sometimes the most loving thing parents can do is make the hardest decision of their lives." Roger looked up at her, confused. "There's a family," Margaret continued gently. "The Washingtons. They've been trying to adopt for years. He's a successful surgeon. She's a pediatric nurse. They specifically want to adopt a child with medical needs because they have the resources and knowledge to help." "You're suggesting we give up our daughter?" Roger's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm suggesting you save her life," Margaret replied. "Sometimes love means letting go." That night, Roger and Jody held each other in her hospital bed and cried, until they had no tears left. They talked about their options, about their dreams, about the life they'd imagined for their little family. By morning, they knew what they had to do. The next day, Dr. James Washington and his wife Marie came to meet them. They were in their 40s, unable to have children of their own, and they looked at baby Brenda with the same wonder and love that Roger and Jody felt. "We want you to know," Dr. Washington said, his voice gentle but firm, "that we will love her as if she were born to us. She will know she's adopted, and if you ever want to be part of her life, we would welcome that." Marie Washington, tears streaming down her face, took Jody's hand. "I want to thank you," she whispered, "for giving us the chance to be parents, for trusting us with your precious gift." The paperwork was a blur. Roger and Jody signed document after document, each signature feeling like they were signing their own death warrant. But when they learned that Dr. Washington could perform their daughter's surgery himself, that she would have the best possible care, they knew they were making the right choice. On their last night with Brenda, Roger and Jody stayed up all night, taking turns holding her, memorizing every detail of her perfect face. Jody sang to her, her voice breaking with each note. Roger told her stories about the house they would have built for her, with a swing set in the backyard and a room painted pink with stars on the ceiling. "Mama loves you so much," Jody whispered, her tears falling on their daughter's face. "I love you so much that I'm letting you go. I'm giving you to people who can take care of you the way you deserve. But you need to know, baby girl, that there will never be a day when Mama doesn't think about you, doesn't love you, doesn't miss you." Roger, holding his daughter for the last time, pressed his lips to her forehead. "Daddy promises you something, princess. Someday, somehow, I will find you again, and when I do, I'll spend the rest of my life making up for this moment. I love you, Brenda Marie Hudson. No matter what your last name becomes, you will always be my daughter." As they walked away from the hospital, leaving their heart behind in that tiny room, Roger and Jody clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. They had given away their most precious possession to save her life, and it had destroyed them both. But love, true love, sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice, and theirs was just beginning. Chapter 2. 30 years of living death. 30 years. 10,950 days since Roger Hudson and Jody Perrin had walked out of Mercy General Hospital with empty arms and shattered hearts. Yet here they stood, every October 15th without fail, in Section B of Restwood Cemetery, staring at a small pink granite headstone that read, "Baby Girl Hudson, forever in our hearts." The grave was empty. They knew their daughter was alive, somewhere, thriving hopefully, but they had bought this plot anyway. A place to come when the grief became too heavy to carry, when the wandering became too painful to bear alone. 50 today, Jody whispered, kneeling to place fresh pink roses at the base of the headstone. At 49, she was still beautiful. But 30 years of heartbreak had etched fine lines around her eyes and painted silver threads through her auburn hair. Our baby girl would be 50 today. Roger, now 50, his once lean frame filled out from years of physical labor and success, placed his weathered hand on his wife's shoulder. He'd kept himself strong for both of them, building Hudson Construction from nothing into a multi-million-dollar company. But here, in this place of their deepest sorrow, his carefully constructed walls crumbled like sand. 30, he corrected gently, his voice thick with the tears he'd been holding back all day. She'd be 30, Jody, 30 years old. The mistake broke something inside Jody, and she collapsed forward, her hands pressed against the cold granite. "Oh God, Roger, I can't even remember right anymore. 30 years, and I can't even remember her age right." Roger dropped to his knees beside his wife, pulling her into his arms, as she sobbed with the same devastating grief as the day they'd given their daughter away. This was their ritual, their annual breaking, the one day of the year when they allowed themselves to feel the full weight of their loss. "I remember everything else," Jody choked out between sobs. "I remember how her hand felt wrapped around my finger. I remember the little sound she made when she slept. I remember the way she smelled, like baby powder and hope. But I can't keep her age straight in my head because she's not here to grow up in front of us." The truth was, both Roger and Jody had become masters at compartmentalizing their grief. Jody had channeled her need to nurture into becoming one of the most sought-after family therapists in the state. She specialized in helping mothers who had lost children, understanding their pain in ways that few could. Her office walls were covered with thank you cards from women she'd helped find their way back to living, though she'd never told them the source of her deep empathy. But at night, alone in their beautiful home that had never heard the sound of children's laughter, Jody would sometimes slip into the room they'd prepared as a nursery 30 years ago, and never had the heart to change. The crib was still there, white and perfect, along with stuffed animals that had never been loved and books that had never been read aloud. Roger dealt with his grief differently, but no less intensely. Hudson Construction had become his tribute. To the daughter he'd lost, every house he built was constructed with the love and care he'd wanted to give Brenda. He employed dozens of people, many of them young fathers struggling to make ends meet, just as he had been. He paid them well, offered excellent benefits, and never let a family worry about medical bills if their children got sick. What no one knew, not even Jody, was that Roger anonymously donated millions to children's heart foundations across the country. Every successful project, every profitable year, he gave away half of his earnings to families facing the same impossible choice they'd faced 30 years ago. In his mind, he was still trying to save his daughter, one child at a time. The worst part wasn't the grief, though. The worst part was the hope. Every year, Roger hired a private investigator to try to find some trace of Brenda. He needed to know she was alive, thriving, happy. The investigators had found records of her adoption, learned that she'd been successfully treated for her heart condition, even discovered that she'd graduated valedictorian from high school and received a full scholarship to medical school. Dr. Brenda Washington, the latest investigator, had reported just last month, cardiac surgeon at Presbyterian Hospital. By all accounts, she's brilliant, successful, and... He'd paused here, and Roger's heart had clenched. And she appears to be searching for her birth parents. That information had sent both Roger and Jody into a tailspin of hope and terror. What if she found them? What if she hated them? What if she understood why they'd given her up? What if she didn't? They'd tried to have other children. God knows they'd tried. But Jody's body, broken by grief and guilt, had betrayed them again and again. 4 miscarriages in 6 years, each one feeling like they were losing Brenda all over again. After the 4th loss, they'd stopped trying, both of them too emotionally shattered to risk that kind of pain again. "Do you think she's happy?" Jody asked now, her voice small and broken as she traced their daughter's name on the headstone with her finger. "I hope so," Roger replied, though the words came out like a prayer. "I pray so every single day." They'd established other rituals. Over the years, small ways of staying connected to the daughter they'd never known. Every year on her birthday, they donated toys to the children's hospital. Every Christmas, they sponsored a family who couldn't afford presents. On Mother's Day and Father's Day, they volunteered at the local orphanage, but it was never enough. Nothing could fill the Brenda-shaped hole in their hearts. "I had the dream again last night," Jody confessed, still staring at the headstone. "The one where she comes home." Roger knew the dream. Jody had been having variations of it for 30 years. Sometimes Brenda came to their door as a child, sometimes as an adult. Sometimes she was angry, sometimes forgiving. Sometimes she brought grandchildren they'd never met. The dream always ended the same way, with Jody waking up reaching for a daughter who wasn't there. "What happened this time?" Roger asked gently. "She was older this time, a woman, beautiful, successful. She had kind eyes." Jody's voice grew wonderstruck. "She said she understood. She said she knew we did it out of love, not because we didn't want her. And Roger..." Jody turned to look at her husband, tears streaming down her face. "She called me Mama." The word hung in the air between them like a sacred thing. Mama. Roger had never heard anyone call Jody that, and the longing in her voice when she said it made his chest ache. "Maybe it's a sign," Roger said quietly. "Maybe somewhere, somehow, she's thinking about us too." They stayed at the cemetery until sunset, as they did every year. They told their empty grave about their lives, about the business, about the families they'd helped, about how they'd tried to honor her memory. They promised, as they did every year, that they'd never stop loving her, never stop hoping, never stop believing that someday, somehow, they'd see her again. As they walked back to their car, a luxury sedan that felt empty without car seats. In the back, Roger took Jodi's hand. After 30 years of marriage, their love had deepened and evolved, tempered by shared grief, but made stronger by mutual understanding. They were each other's lifeline, the only people in the world who truly understood the weight of their loss. "I love you, Jodi Hudson," Roger said, using the married name she'd taken, but somehow had never felt like she deserved. "I love you for the mother you are, even if the world can't see it." "I love you too," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for never giving up on us. Thank you for staying." As they drove home through the autumn evening, neither of them could have imagined that 50 miles away, a young cardiac surgeon named Dr. Brenda Washington was staring at her own reflection in her office window, wondering if her birth parents ever thought about her, ever missed her, ever regretted the choice they'd made. Neither could they have imagined that in just 2 weeks their worlds would collide in the most unexpected way possible, and that the daughter they'd given up to save would end up saving them in return. But love has a way of coming full circle, and some bonds are too strong to be broken by time, distance, or even the most impossible circumstances. Their reunion was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. Chapter 3. The Daughter Who Never Forgot. Dr. Brenda Washington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office at Presbyterian Hospital, watching the sun set over the city she'd called home for the past 5 years. At 30, she was the youngest African-American female cardiac surgeon in the hospital's history, a prodigy who could repair the most complex heart defects with hands so steady they seemed guided by something beyond medical training. But tonight, those same hands trembled as she held a manila envelope that had arrived that morning, an envelope that contained the last will and testament of Marie Washington, the woman who'd raised her, loved her, and died just 3 months ago after a brutal battle with cancer. "My dearest Brenda," the letter inside began, written in Marie's careful script. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're finally ready to learn the truth about where you came from." Brenda sank into her leather chair, her heart pounding with the same irregular rhythm she'd been born with, the rhythm that had nearly killed her before she'd taken her first real breath. Marie had always been honest about the adoption, about the fact that Brenda had been born with a serious heart condition, but she'd never shared the details. "When you're ready," had always been her answer. "When your heart is strong enough to handle it." Now, apparently, that time had come. "Your birth mother was 19 when she had you," the letter continued. "Your birth father was 20. They were babies themselves, barely out of high school, working multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. When you were born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, they faced an impossible choice." Brenda's breath caught in her throat. She knew about hypoplastic left heart syndrome. It was one of her specialties. She'd performed dozens of surgeries on babies born with the condition, and she knew exactly how expensive and complex the treatment was. Most families struggled to afford it, even with good insurance. They sold everything they owned to pay for your initial care. Everything, Brenda. Their wedding rings, their car, their furniture. Your birth mother, Jodi, insisted on breastfeeding you for the first 3 days, even though she knew she was going to give you up. She said she wanted to give you the best start possible. Tears began streaming down Brenda's face as she read. She'd always wondered why she'd been given up, had always assumed it was because she wasn't wanted, because her birth parents couldn't handle having a biracial child, because she was somehow not good enough to keep. Your birth father, Roger, held you every moment he was allowed to. The nurses told me he sang to you, told you stories, promised you things he knew he'd never be able to give you. When they made the decision to place you for adoption, it wasn't because they didn't love you, sweetheart. It was because they loved you more than they loved themselves. The letter went on to describe the meeting between Marie and James Washington, and Roger and Jodi Hudson. Marie described how Roger had made James promise to send pictures every year, how Jody had asked Marie to tell Brenda that she loved her if she ever asked about her birth mother. "They gave me a letter to give you when you were ready," Marie had written. "It's in the safety deposit box, along with the blanket they wrapped you in, and a recording of your birth father singing you a lullaby. They wanted you to have pieces of them, even if they couldn't be part of your life." Brenda sat in stunned silence as the full weight of the truth settled over her. Her birth parents hadn't abandoned her. They'd saved her. They'd sacrificed everything, including their own hearts, to give her a chance at life. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent her career saving hearts, while her own had remained broken, guarded, incomplete. She'd never been able to sustain a romantic relationship, always pushing people away before they could leave her. She'd built walls around her emotions so high that even James, her adoptive father, had struggled to connect with her after Marie's death. "I'm dying," she'd told her ex-fiancé Michael just 6 months ago, though she'd been perfectly healthy at the time. "I'm dying from the inside out, and I don't know how to let anyone close enough to save me." Michael had begged her to try the counseling, to try medication, to try anything that might help her heal. But how could she heal from a wound she didn't fully understand? How could she fix a heart that felt fundamentally broken? Now, finally, she understood. The ache she'd carried her entire life wasn't just about being adopted. It was about being separated from parents who'd loved her enough to give her up. It was about carrying their sacrifice without knowing the weight of it. That night, Brenda drove to the cemetery where Marie was buried and sat beside her adoptive mother's grave, reading the letter aloud as if Marie could still hear her. "You should have told me sooner," she whispered to the headstone. "You should have told me they loved me." But even as she said it, Brenda understood why Marie had waited. At 18, she would have been angry. At 25, she would have been resentful. But at 30, having spent years saving the lives of children born with the same condition she'd had, she could finally comprehend the magnitude of her birth parents' sacrifice. The next morning, Brenda called the private investigator she'd hired 6 months ago, a recommendation from a colleague who'd successfully found her own birth family. "I need you to find Roger Hudson and Jody Hudson, formerly Jody Perrin," she told him. "They would be in their early 50s now, possibly still in the Chicago area." "Dr. Washington," the investigator said gently, "I found them 3 weeks ago. I've been waiting for you to call me back." Brenda's heart stopped. "You found them? Are they alive?" "Very much alive. Roger Hudson owns Hudson Construction. It's one of the most successful companies in the state. Jody Hudson is a family therapist, specializes in grief counseling. They live in Winnetka, no children. He paused. "They've been looking for you too, Dr. Washington, for years." The phone slipped from Brenda's nerveless fingers. They'd been looking for her for years. That evening, Brenda sat in her apartment, a beautiful space that felt more like a museum than a home, and stared at the photos the investigator had provided. Roger Hudson, now 50, still handsome but weathered by time and what looked like deep sadness. Jody Hudson, 49, still beautiful but with eyes that held the same haunted quality Brenda recognized in her own mirror. They looked like people who'd loved and lost. People who'd been carrying a burden for 30 years. The investigator had provided more than just photos. He'd given her a detailed report of their lives, Roger's success in construction, his anonymous donations to children's charities, Jody's work with grieving mothers, their annual visits to a cemetery plot they'd purchased for a baby girl, Hudson. They'd bought her a grave. They'd been visiting an empty grave for 30 years, mourning a daughter they'd given up to save. Brenda spent the next week immersed in research, not the kind she usually did on surgical procedures, but research into her own origins, She learned about the trailer park where she'd been born, about the multiple jobs Roger had worked to try to support his young family, about the medical bills that had been mounting even before she was born. She learned that Roger had built his company into an empire, partly through his insistence on providing excellent health insurance for his employees. She learned that Jody had helped hundreds of women navigate the grief of losing children, never revealing that she knew their pain intimately. They'd turned their loss into purpose, their grief into a force for good in the world. But more than that, she learned about their love story. High school sweethearts who'd married young and stayed devoted to each other through 30 years of heartbreak. Neighbors described them as inseparable, still holding hands when they walked, still looking at each other like newlyweds despite the sadness they carried. The investigator had one more piece of information that stopped Brenda's heart completely. "They never tried to replace you," he told her during their final phone call. "Mrs. Hudson had several miscarriages over the years, but they never successfully had another child. In some ways, it's like they've been waiting for you to come home." That night, Brenda stood in front of her bathroom mirror and really looked at herself for the first time in years. She had Jody's eyes, the same shape, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. She had Roger's hands, long-fingered and strong, perfect for the delicate work of surgery. She was a combination of two people who'd loved her enough to break their own hearts, and she'd spent 30 years not knowing it. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a way to contact them. Tomorrow, she would begin the journey of healing the wounds that had defined her entire life. Tomorrow, she would try to bridge the gap between the girl who'd been given away and the woman who'd been saved. But tonight, for the first time in her adult life, Dr. Brenda Washington fell asleep without the recurring nightmare that had haunted her dreams, the dream of crying voices calling her name while she walked away, unable to turn back. Tonight, she dreamed of coming home. Chapter 4. When Hearts Collide. The October morning started like any other for Roger Hudson. He woke at 5:30 a.m., kissed his sleeping wife gently on the forehead, and dressed quietly in the darkness of their bedroom. At 50, he still maintained the discipline of his younger years, still felt the need to be the first one on every job site, still carried the weight of responsibility for the dozens of families who depended on Hudson Construction for their livelihoods. But as he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, knotting his tie, Roger felt an unfamiliar pressure in his chest. He'd been feeling it on and off for weeks, a tightness, a heaviness that he'd attributed to stress. The anniversary of Brenda's birth was always difficult, and this year had been particularly brutal. 30 years, 3 decades since he'd held his daughter in his arms. Just stress, he muttered to his reflection, the same lie he'd been telling himself for weeks. By 7 a.m., Roger was at the Riverside Elementary School construction site, the latest in a series of schools his company had built throughout the city. This one was special. They were building it in a low-income neighborhood, and Roger had negotiated the contract at cost, essentially donating his labor and that of his crew. Every time he watched children play in the schoolyards of the buildings he'd constructed, he imagined a little girl with dark curls and wise brown eyes running among them. "Boss, you okay?" asked Tommy Martinez, his foreman for the past 8 years. "You look pale." Roger forced a smile and pushed the growing pressure in his chest aside. "I'm fine, Tommy. Just need some coffee." But as the morning progressed, the pressure intensified. By 10 a.m., Roger was sweating despite the cool October air. By 11 a.m., the pain had spread down his left arm, and his vision was starting to blur around the edges. He was climbing down from a scaffold when it hit him like a freight train. The heart attack struck with devastating force, dropping Roger to his knees on the concrete. The last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him was Tommy's voice screaming for someone to call 911, and a single desperate thought: I can't die without seeing her again. 15 miles away, Dr. Brenda Washington was in the middle of what should have been a routine surgery, a mitral valve replacement on a 60-year-old man who reminded her painfully of James, her adoptive father. She'd been thinking about her birth parents all morning, about the phone call she'd planned to make that evening, about the conversation that could change everything. The surgery was going perfectly when her pager buzzed with an emergency code. Level 1 trauma, massive MI, myocardial infarction, heart attack. Dr. Park can finish up here, she told her surgical team, already stripping off her gloves. I need to get to the ER. Brenda had handled hundreds of heart attack cases, but something about this one felt different from the moment she burst through the emergency room doors. The patient was being wheeled in, paramedics performing CPR, his face grey and lifeless. What do we have? She barked, falling into step beside the gurney. 50-year-old male, massive anterior wall MI, the lead paramedic reported. Down for approximately 8 minutes before we got him back. Vitals are weak but stable. Brenda's trained eye took in the patient as they wheeled him into Trauma Bay 3. Tall, broad-shouldered despite the obvious physical stress, calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of physical work. Something about him tugged at her consciousness, but she pushed the feeling aside and focused on saving his life. Get me a cardiothoracic OR prepped now, she ordered. This man needs emergency surgery. As her team worked to stabilize the patient, Brenda caught sight of a woman running down the hallway, her face a mask of terror and desperation. The woman was in her late 40s, auburn hair streaked with silver, wearing a business suit that looked hastily thrown on. She moved with the desperate urgency of someone whose entire world was falling apart. "Where is he?" the woman screamed at the reception desk. "Where's my husband, Roger Hudson? They brought him in from the construction site. Please, I need to see him." Brenda's heart stopped. Roger Hudson. The name echoed in her mind like a bell, connecting with information she'd read just days ago in a private investigator's report. But it couldn't be. It was impossible. Chicago had millions of people, hundreds of Roger Hudsons. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," one of the nurses was saying to the woman, but she was beyond hearing. "You don't understand," the woman sobbed, her knees buckling. "He's all I have. He's everything. We lost our daughter 30 years ago, and if I lose him too, I have nothing, nothing." The words hit Brenda like a physical blow. 30 years ago, lost their daughter. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity, but she couldn't process it now. She had a life to save. "Get Mrs. Hudson to the family waiting room," Brenda ordered curtly, "and somebody get her some water and a sedative if she needs it." As they wheeled Roger Hudson into the operating room, Brenda caught a glimpse of his face under the harsh fluorescent lights. Even unconscious, even grey with cardiac distress, there was something familiar about his features, something that made her hands shake as she scrubbed in. The surgery was the most challenging of Brenda's career, not because of technical complexity, but because of the emotional weight pressing down on her chest. As she worked to repair the massive damage to Roger's heart, as she placed stents and bypassed blocked arteries, she found herself whispering things she'd never said during surgery before. "Come on," she murmured, as his heart rhythm faltered on the monitor. "Don't give up. She needs you. Jody needs you." Her surgical team glanced at each other, surprised by their normally stoic chief's emotional investment in this particular patient. But they'd worked with Dr. Washington long enough to trust her instincts. For 8 hours, Brenda fought for Roger Hudson's life with everything she possessed. She used every skill she'd mastered, every technique she'd perfected, every ounce of determination that had carried her through medical school and residency. This wasn't just another patient. This might be her father, the man who'd sung her lullabies in those precious first days of life, the man who'd held her and promised to find her again When Roger's heart finally began beating strong and steady, when his color returned and his vital signs stabilized, Brenda felt a rush of emotion so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. "Excellent work, Dr. Washington," her chief resident said as they closed. "You saved his life." But as Brenda looked down at the man on the operating table, at the face that might belong to the father she'd never known, she realized that this surgery had done more than save a life. It had brought her face to face with her own destiny. In the recovery room, as Roger slowly regained consciousness, his first word was barely a whisper. "Jody." "She's here," Brenda said softly, taking his hand. "Your wife is here, Mr. Hudson. You're going to be okay." Roger's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with medication, but when they met Brenda's, something passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than consciousness, deeper than memory. "Angel," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my angel." Brenda's breath caught in her throat. "Rest now, Mr. Hudson. You need to rest." But as she left his room to find Jody Hudson, Brenda's heart was pounding with the realization that everything in her life had led to this moment. Every year of medical school, every hour of residency, every surgery she'd performed had prepared her for this, to save the life of the man who might be her father. In the family waiting room, she found Jody Hudson exactly where she'd expected her to be, curled up in a chair, still wearing the same business suit from that morning, her face streaked with tears and exhaustion. "Mrs. Hudson," Brenda said softly. Jody looked up, and when their eyes met, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Brenda saw her own eyes looking back at her, the same shape, the same color, the same way of holding steady in a crisis. "Your husband is going to be fine," Brenda said, her voice barely steady. "The surgery was successful, he's stable, and with proper care and rehabilitation, he should make a full recovery." Jody's face crumpled with relief, and she reached out instinctively to grasp Brenda's hand. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you for saving him. You don't understand. He's my whole world. We've been through so much together, lost so much. I couldn't lose him too." The touch of Jody's hand sent electricity through Brenda's entire body. This woman's hands, holding hers with desperate gratitude, felt familiar in a way that defied explanation. "Mrs. Hudson," Brenda said carefully, "can I ask you something? You mentioned losing a daughter 30 years ago." Jody's face went white, and she pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned. Why would you, what was her name?" Brenda pressed gently. "Your daughter's name?" Tears began streaming down Jody's face again, but different tears now, tears of recognition, of impossible hope, of a miracle 30 years in the making. "Brenda," she whispered, her voice breaking on the single word. Her name was Brenda. The world stopped. Time suspended itself as two women stared at each other across the space of 30 years, across the divide of loss and love and sacrifice, finally seeing what had always been there. "Mama," Brenda whispered, the word falling from her lips like a prayer, and in that moment, in the sterile waiting room of Presbyterian Hospital, a family began to heal. Chapter 5. The Recognition That Stops Time. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge across 30 years of separation. "Mama!" It was barely a whisper, but it echoed through the hospital waiting room like thunder. Jody Hudson stared at the woman in scrubs standing before her, this accomplished surgeon who had just saved her husband's life and felt reality shift beneath her feet. The face before her was older, refined by education and success, more beautiful than any dream she'd dared to have. But the eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were exactly the same as the baby she'd held 3 decades ago. "It can't be," Jody breathed, her hand flying to her chest as if to hold her breaking heart together. "It can't be you. You're Dr. Washington. You're Dr. Brenda Washington," Brenda said, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. But I was born Brenda Hudson. I was born on October 15th, 1994, to a 19-year-old girl named Jody Perrin and a 20-year-old boy named Roger Hudson. I was born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, and my birth parents gave me up for adoption so I could receive the medical care they couldn't afford. Each word fell like a hammer blow, and with each one, Jody's face crumpled further. When Brenda finished speaking, Jody was doubled over in her chair, sobbing so hard her entire body shook. "My baby!" she wailed, the sound echoing off the waiting room walls. "My baby girl, you're alive. You're really alive." Brenda dropped to her knees in front of Jody's chair, her own tears streaming down her face. "I'm alive because of you, because of what you and Roger did. You saved my life by giving me up." "I never stopped thinking about you," Jody choked, out, reaching with trembling hands to touch Brenda's face. "Not one single day. I wondered if you were happy, if you were healthy, if you knew that we loved you. Oh God, Brenda, I have dreamed of this moment for 30 years. The touch of her birth mother's hands on her face was like coming home to a place Brenda had never been, but had always been searching for. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes and feeling 30 years of questions finally getting their answers. "I know," Brenda whispered. "I hired a private investigator. I know about the grave you bought, about the cemetery visits, about how you've been looking for me. I know about Dad's donations to children's hospitals, about your work helping other mothers who've lost children. I know you never forgot me." "Never," Jody said fiercely, her hands now framing Brenda's face completely. "Never for a single moment. You were always in my heart, always in my prayers. I used to lie awake at night wondering if you were cold, if you were scared, if you needed me." "I was scared," Brenda admitted, her voice breaking. "I was scared for 30 years because I thought you didn't want me. I thought there was something wrong with me, something that made me unlovable. I pushed everyone away because I was afraid they'd leave me like I thought you had." Jody's face contorted with pain. "Oh, sweetheart. Oh, my precious girl. We wanted you more than we wanted our own lives. Giving you up was like tearing out our hearts and walking away from them. We thought about you every single day, missed you every single moment." Other families in the waiting room had stopped their own conversations to stare at the dramatic reunion unfolding before them. Several nurses had gathered in the doorway, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed something that seemed more like a miracle than mere coincidence. "I need to show you something," Brenda said, reaching into her lab coat pocket. She pulled out a worn photograph, the baby picture that Marie Washington had given her years ago, the one showing a tiny infant in a hospital bed surrounded by tubes and wires. Jody's breath caught when she saw it. "That's from your first day in the NICU. I remember when they took that picture. You were so small, so fragile, but you were fighting so hard." "Do you have pictures?" Brenda asked desperately. "From those first 3 days? I don't remember anything, and I've always wondered." Jody's face lit up through her tears. "I have hundreds. They're at home in your room. We kept your room exactly the way it was, filled with everything we ever wanted to give you." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I have a video, too. Roger singing to you. He sang you the same lullaby every night." "What lullaby?" Brenda asked, though somewhere deep in her soul she already knew. Jody's voice was soft and broken as she began to sing. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Daddy's gonna buy you a mockingbird." The melody hit Brenda like a physical force. She'd been humming that song her entire life, never knowing where she'd learned it, never understanding why it always made her feel safe and sad at the same time. "He sang that to me every night in the NICU," Jody continued. "He would hold you and sing, and you would calm down instantly, like you knew his voice was meant for you." "I remember," Brenda whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was memory or just the power of finally understanding. Not consciously, but somewhere inside. I remember feeling safe when I heard that song. They held each other then, mother and daughter, strangers and family, two pieces of a puzzle that had been separated for 3 decades, finally clicking back into place. Around them, the hospital continued its busy routine, but in their bubble of reunion, time seemed suspended. "I need to see him," Brenda said finally. "I need to see Roger. Does he know who I am?" "He will," Jody said with certainty. "He's been waiting for you just as long as I have, maybe longer. He blamed himself, you know, for not being able to provide for you, for not being enough." They walked together to Roger's recovery room, Jody's hand clutched in Brenda's like a lifeline. Outside his door they paused, both women gathering courage for a moment 30 years in the making. Roger was awake, staring at the ceiling with the hollow look of a man who'd come too close to death. But when Jody and Brenda entered together, his entire demeanor changed. He struggled to sit up, his eyes moving between his wife and the woman beside her. "Jody," he said hoarsely, "who is this? She looks—" "Roger," Jody said, her voice trembling with joy and disbelief, "I want you to meet our daughter. This is Brenda, our Brenda." Roger's face went through a series of emotions so rapid and intense, it was like watching 30 years of grief, hope, and love play out in fast forward. Disbelief, recognition, overwhelming joy, and finally, a kind of peace that transformed his entire being. "Brenda," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "My princess, you came back to me." "I never left, Daddy," Brenda said. The word Daddy, feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on her tongue. "I was just waiting for the right moment to come home." She approached his bedside slowly, as if approaching something sacred. When she took his hand, the same hand that had held her as a newborn, that had promised to find her again, Roger squeezed with surprising strength. "You saved my life," he said, awe in his voice. "My own daughter saved my life. You saved mine." "First," Brenda replied, 30 years ago, you and Mama saved my life by loving me enough to let me go." Roger brought their joined hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I promised I'd find you again. And here you are." "Actually," Brenda said with a watery smile, "I think I found you." The three of them laughed and cried simultaneously, a sound of pure joy that echoed through the cardiac wing and made every nurse and doctor within earshot smile, despite themselves. "I have so many questions," Brenda said, looking back and forth. "Between her parents, I want to know everything. What you were like when you were young, how you met, what your dreams were, what your lives have been like. I want to know about the miscarriages, about the empty bedroom, about every single day of the last 30 years. "We have time," Jody said, smoothing Brenda's hair with the tenderness of a mother who'd been waiting 3 decades to perform that simple gesture. "We have all the time in the world now. I want to know about you, too," Roger said, his voice growing stronger by the moment. "I want to know what your childhood was like, what made you want to become a doctor, what your favorite, and color is what makes you laugh. I want to know my daughter." "I want to know why I became a cardiac surgeon," Brenda said wonderingly. "I always thought it was just because I was good at it. But now, I think maybe it was because I was always trying to fix the thing that was broken in me. And maybe I was preparing for this moment when I'd need to fix the heart of the man who gave me mine." As the afternoon dissolved into evening, the three of them talked and cried and marveled at the impossible confluence of events that had brought them together. They shared stories and pictures and 30 years' worth of love that had been waiting for exactly this moment to be expressed. And for the first time in 30 years, Roger Hudson, Jody Hudson, and Brenda Washington felt completely, utterly, perfectly whole. Chapter 6. Tears of Joy and Forgiveness. 3 days after the reunion, Brenda sat in her childhood bedroom for the first time in 30 years, and the sight before her broke her heart into a million beautiful pieces. The room was exactly as Jody had described it, a shrine to the daughter they'd never been able to raise, filled with 30 years' worth of birthday presents, Christmas gifts, and tokens of love that had accumulated like sediment from a river, of hope that had never run dry. The walls were painted a soft pink that had faded with time, and glow-in-the-dark stars still clung to the ceiling. Stars that Roger had painstakingly applied one night when Jody was 5 months pregnant. Dreaming of the bedtime stories he would tell their daughter about constellations and wishes and dreams that come true. The crib was still there, white and pristine despite the decades, with a mobile of butterflies that Jody had made by hand during her pregnancy, each delicate wing sewn with the hope that her daughter would someday soar. But it was the mountain of presents that absolutely destroyed Brenda's composure. 30 birthday presents, each wrapped with meticulous care and tagged with her name in handwriting that had evolved over the years but never lost its tenderness. 30 Christmas presents, ranging from baby toys to teenage clothes to adult books, each chosen with the kind of love that comes from imagining a child's changing interests and needs, with nothing but hope to guide the selections. There were stuffed animals and dolls, jewelry and clothes, books and music, art supplies and sports equipment, a lifetime of gifts given to someone who wasn't there to receive them, but who was loved enough to deserve them anyway. "We didn't know what you'd like," Jody said softly from the doorway, her voice thick with emotion as she watched her daughter discover 30 years of accumulated love. "So, we tried to cover every possibility. Every year on your birthday, we'd drive to the mall and spend hours shopping, debating what to get you. Roger always wanted to buy you tools because he hoped you'd want to learn construction like him. I always wanted to buy you dresses because I dreamed of taking you shopping for prom, for college, for your wedding someday." Brenda picked up a wrapped present marked "Happy 16th birthday, Brenda, love, Mum and Dad" in Roger's careful block letters. Her hands shook as she held it, imagining her parents in a store somewhere, debating over teenage gifts for a daughter they might never see again, but loving her enough to keep hoping, keep trying, keep believing that someday she'd come home. To open them. "Can I open them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter this moment like spun glass. "They're yours," Roger said from behind Jody, still moving carefully but insisting on being there despite his recent surgery. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "They've always been yours. We bought every single one imagining your face. When you opened it, now we finally get to see that face." What followed was the most bittersweet Christmas morning imaginable, compressed into an afternoon that felt both eternal and fleeting. Brenda opened 30 years of presents while her parents watched, their faces cycling through joy and grief and wonder in an endless loop of emotions too complex for words. There were baby clothes that would never be worn, tiny onesies with sayings, like "Daddy's girl" and "Mommy's little angel." There were toys that would never be played with, dolls and blocks and stuffed animals that had waited patiently in their wrapping for decades. There were books that would never be read at bedtime, picture books about princesses and animals and faraway places that Roger had planned to read aloud in funny voices, but there were also prescient gifts that showed how well they'd known her. Despite the distance, choices that seemed guided by some parental intuition that transcended physical separation. Medical textbooks they'd bought when she was in high school, somehow hoping she'd go into healthcare. A stethoscope they'd purchased when she graduated college, following an instinct they couldn't explain. Anatomy models and medical journals, and even scrubs in her size, as if they'd been preparing for the exact career she'd chosen without knowing it. "How did you know?" Brenda asked through her tears, holding up the stethoscope that was identical to her first one. "How did you know I'd become a doctor?" "We didn't know," Roger admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But we hoped. We hoped you'd want to help people, to heal them. When you were a baby, even sick as you were, you had this way of calming down when the nurses talked to you. You seemed to respond to their voices, their gentleness. It seemed like something you'd do. Spend your life helping others the way you were helped. The photographs were even more overwhelming than the presents. Jody had kept every newspaper clipping, every magazine article, every mention of Dr. Brenda Washington she could find over the years. There were photos of Brenda at her medical school graduation, at award ceremonies, at hospital functions, all taken from a distance by a mother who wasn't allowed to be proud publicly, but was bursting with pride privately. There were enlargements of photos that had appeared in medical journals, pictures that Jody had blown up and framed as if they were family portraits. "I was at your graduation," Jody confessed, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as she pulled out a photo album labeled "Our Brenda from Afar." "From medical school. I sat in the very back, and when they called your name, I stood up and applauded like the proud mama I was. The people around me probably thought I was crazy, clapping so enthusiastically for someone they assumed I didn't know. But you were mine, even if you didn't know it." "You were there." Brenda's voice cracked completely. "All those years you were watching me. Wild horses couldn't have kept me away. I've been to every public event of yours I could find. Your first published paper presentation. I drove 4 hours to Detroit for that conference and sat in the back row, so proud I could barely contain myself. Your promotion ceremony at the hospital. I stood outside in the rain watching through the windows. That interview you did on the news about childhood heart defects, I recorded it, and I've watched it probably 100 times, just to hear your voice, to see your face animated and passionate about your work." The guilt hit Brenda like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her double over with the weight of it. "I've been so angry," she whispered, her words muffled by sobs. "For so long, I've been angry at you for giving me up. I thought you didn't want me. I thought I wasn't good enough. I thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me unlovable." "Oh, sweetheart," Jody said, rushing to kneel beside her daughter on the floor, surrounded by 30 years of love made manifest. "You were everything. You were perfect. You were wanted and loved and treasured beyond measure. We didn't give you up because we didn't want you. We gave you up because we wanted you to live. We wanted you to have everything we couldn't give you." "I know that now," Brenda said, leaning into her mother's embrace like a child seeking comfort. "But I need you to understand what it was like. Growing up always feeling like something was missing, like there was a hole in my heart that couldn't be filled. I felt rejected by the most important people in my life before I even knew who you were. I couldn't trust anyone completely because I was always waiting for them to leave me too. I sabotaged every relationship I ever had because I was so afraid of being abandoned again." Roger joined them on the floor, his recovery forgotten in the face of his daughter's pain. His knees protested, but he didn't care. "That's on us," he said heavily, his voice thick with guilt and regret. "That's our fault. We should have found a way to stay in touch, to let you know you were loved. We should have fought harder to be part of your life." "No," Brenda said firmly, pulling back to look at both her parents through her tears. "Don't you dare blame yourselves. You did what you had to do. The Washingtons, my adoptive parents, they were amazing. They loved me completely, gave me everything I needed to succeed. But they couldn't fill the hole that was left by not knowing why I was given up, by not understanding that it was love, not abandonment, that drove that choice." They spent hours that first day sharing stories, filling in the blanks of 30 years of separation with words and tears and laughter that came in waves. Brenda learned about her parents' early marriage, about how they'd met in high school when Roger was the shy construction worker's son and Jody was the popular girl who saw past his rough exterior to the gentle heart beneath. She learned about the struggles that had brought them closer together rather than tearing them apart, about how every hardship had been weathered together, hand in hand. She learned about Roger's rise from poverty to success, driven not by ambition, but by the desperate desire to never again be unable to provide for his family. Every contract he'd won, every building he'd constructed, every dollar he'd earned, had been motivated by the memory of signing adoption papers because he couldn't afford to save his daughter's life. She learned about Jodie's journey into therapy, motivated by her own unhealed grief and desire to help other mothers navigate loss. Every woman she'd counseled, every family she'd helped heal, had been her way of making sense of her own heartbreak, of finding purpose in pain. In return, Brenda shared her own story, her childhood with the Washingtons, who had been wonderful parents, but couldn't erase the fundamental questions about her origins. She told them about her struggle with feeling abandoned despite being loved, about the way that early wound had shaped her personality, making her driven and successful, but also guarded and afraid of intimacy. She told them about her failed relationships, her inability to trust completely, her workaholism that kept her from having to face her own emotional needs. She explained how she'd thrown herself into her career not just because she loved medicine, but because achievement felt like the only way to prove she was worthy of love. "I think I became a cardiac surgeon because my own heart was broken," she admitted on the second day as they sat together in the living room that was slowly becoming familiar. "I've spent my career fixing other people's hearts because I couldn't fix my own. Maybe that's why I was so good at it. I understood what it felt like to have something fundamentally wrong with your heart." "Your heart isn't broken, baby girl," Roger said gently, reaching over to take her hand. "It's just been waiting for the right moment to heal. And maybe all those hearts you saved were practice for this moment, when you'd save mine." The healing process wasn't smooth or simple. There were moments of overwhelming grief for the time they'd lost, moments when the weight of 30 years felt too heavy to bear. There were moments of anger at the circumstances that had separated them, at a world that made love and poverty incompatible. There were moments of guilt and regret that threatened to drown them all in what-ifs and should-haves. But there were also moments of pure, transcendent joy that made all the pain worthwhile. When Brenda laughed at one of Roger's construction stories and Jodie gasped because it was exactly the same laugh she'd imagined her daughter having. When Roger heard Brenda humming the lullaby he'd sung to her as a baby and realized she'd carried his voice with her all these years. When all three of them realized they had the same habit of drumming their fingers when they were thinking, the same way of tilting their heads when listening, the same fierce loyalty that had kept their love alive across impossible distances. As the days passed, Brenda felt something she'd never experienced before, the deep, bone-deep security of unconditional love. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to earn affection or prove her worth. She was loved simply because she existed, because she was theirs, because 30 years of separation had only made their hearts grow fonder, not forget. Chapter 7. Building New Bridges. 6 weeks after the reunion, Brenda Hudson Washington, she'd legally added Hudson to her name the previous week, sat at the kitchen table in her parents' house, watching her father attempt to make pancakes while her mother offered running commentary from her seat by the window. It was a Saturday morning ritual they'd established, and Brenda marveled at how quickly they'd fallen into these domestic rhythms, as if 30 years of separation had been merely a long absence, not a lifetime apart. "Roger, you're going to burn them again," Jodie warned, not looking up from the photo albums she was organizing. 30 years' worth of pictures she'd taken from a distance, now being arranged chronologically so Brenda could see her life through her birth mother's eyes. "I'm not going to burn them," Roger protested, but even as he spoke, smoke was beginning to rise from the pan. "I've been making pancakes longer than you've been alive, young lady." You've been burning pancakes longer than I've been alive, Jody corrected with a smile, and Brenda felt her heart squeeze with the simple domesticity of it all. This was what she'd missed, not just the big moments, but the small ones, the gentle teasing and familiar rhythms of a family that had loved each other through everything. "Let me help, Dad," Brenda said, getting up from the table. The word "Dad" still felt foreign on her tongue, but it was getting easier each time she said it. Roger's face lit up every time she used it, as if he couldn't quite believe he had the right to be called that. As they cooked together, Brenda was struck by how natural it felt to move around the kitchen with him, how they seemed to anticipate each other's movements, despite having no shared history. When Roger reached for the spatula, Brenda was already handing it to him. When she needed the syrup, he was already pulling it from the cabinet. "It's like we've been doing this forever," Roger marveled, watching his daughter flip pancakes with the same practiced ease he'd developed over decades of weekend breakfast preparation. "Maybe we have," Brenda said thoughtfully. "In all the ways you dreamed of teaching me to cook, in all the mornings I wished I had a father to share breakfast with. Maybe love creates muscle memory even when we're apart." The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell, and Jody jumped up to answer it. Brenda heard voices in the hallway, familiar voices that made her stomach drop with sudden anxiety. "Brenda?" James Washington's voice called out. "Are you here, sweetheart?" James Washington entered the kitchen behind Jody, looking every inch the distinguished surgeon he was, but his eyes were soft with concern and curiosity. Behind him came Margaret Washington, Brenda's adoptive mother's sister, who had been like a second mother to Brenda after Marie's death. The moment was charged with an electricity that made everyone pause. Here were the two sets of parents who had shaped Brenda's life, the ones who had given her life and the ones who had raised her, meeting for the first time over pancakes and photo albums in a kitchen filled with 30 years of deferred love. "James, Margaret," Brenda said, her voice tight with nervous energy. "I'd like you to meet Roger and Jody Hudson, my birth parents." The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then James Washington stepped forward, extending his hand to Roger with the dignity that had always characterized him. "Mr. Hudson," he said formally, "I want to thank you for the greatest gift of my life. Brenda has been our joy, our pride, our everything. We are forever in your debt." Roger stared at the outstretched hand for a moment, tears welling in his eyes. Then he pushed the hand aside and pulled James into a fierce embrace that spoke volumes about the gratitude flowing between them. "Thank you," Roger whispered into James's ear, his voice breaking. "Thank you for loving her. Thank you for giving her the life we couldn't. Thank you for making her the incredible woman she became." Margaret and Jody faced each other across the kitchen, two mothers who had loved the same daughter in different ways, at different times, with the same fierce devotion. Margaret spoke first, her voice gentle but strong. "I want to thank the woman who gave me my greatest joy, but broke her own heart to do it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Marie always said that Brenda's birth mother must have loved her beyond measure to make such a sacrifice. She was right." Jody collapsed into Margaret's arms, 30 years of grief and gratitude pouring out in sobs that shook her entire body. "I want to thank the woman who loved my baby when I couldn't," she managed between gasps, "who gave her everything I dreamed of giving her but never could, who raised her to be brilliant and kind and strong." And suddenly they were all crying and embracing and talking at once, the kitchen filling with the sound of a family, not a traditional family, but a family nonetheless, finally coming together around the love they all shared for one extraordinary woman. "I brought something," James said eventually, pulling a worn leather photo album from his briefcase. "Pictures of Brenda growing up. Marie always said that if we ever found you, we'd want to share these." What followed was the most beautiful torture imaginable. Two sets of parents sat around the kitchen table, sharing 30 years of photographs and stories, filling in the blanks of a life that had been lived in parallel universes. Roger and Jody saw their daughter take her first steps, heard about her first words, which had been help. She'd always wanted to heal people, learned about her struggles and triumphs and the moments that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. In return, they shared their own collection. Pictures of the empty bedroom, receipts from birthday shopping trips, copies of every article about Dr. Brenda Washington they'd collected over the years. They showed James and Margaret the storage unit full of presents, the annual cemetery visits, the scholarships they'd funded in Brenda's name. "You never stopped being her parents," Margaret said wonderingly, looking through pictures of Roger and Jody visiting Brenda's empty grave. "Even when you gave her up, you never stopped being her parents. And you never took that away from us," Jody replied, clutching Margaret's hand. "You could have erased us completely, but you always told her she was adopted, always let her know. There were people out there who loved her first. That took incredible courage and generosity." Brenda sat in the middle of it all, surrounded by 4 parents who had shaped her life in different ways, and felt something she'd never experienced before: complete belonging. She wasn't choosing between families or trying to navigate divided loyalties. She was simply the center of a love so big it encompassed everyone in the room. "I want to show you something," she said, getting up to retrieve a folder from her purse. "I've been working on this since the reunion." She spread out architectural plans on the table, detailed blueprints that showed a house with 2 master suites, a medical office and common areas designed for a multi-generational family. "I want us to live together," she said, her voice strong, despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "All of us. I know it's unconventional, but we're not a conventional family. I want James and Margaret close by because they raised me and I love them. I want Roger and Jody close by because they gave me life and I love them. I want us all together because I've spent 30 years feeling incomplete, and this is the only way I can imagine feeling whole." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and fear and hope all tangled together. Finally, Roger spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "You want your old man to live with you, even though I'm still learning how to be your father?" "Especially because you're still learning," Brenda replied. "I want to learn with you. I want Saturday morning pancakes, and bedtime stories I never got, and all the conversations we missed. I want to fight about my dating life and get your advice about work problems, and have you walk me down the aisle someday." "What about your practice?" James asked practically, though his eyes were bright with hope. "Your life is at the hospital." "I've been thinking about that too," Brenda said, pulling out another folder. "I want to start a foundation, the Hudson Washington Foundation for Children's Cardiac Care. I want to make sure no family ever has to make the choice you made," she said, looking at Roger and Jody. "I want to use Roger's business success, James's medical connections, and my surgical skills to provide free cardiac care for children whose families can't afford it." "You want to build something together," Margaret said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Not just a house, but a legacy." "I want to build everything together," Brenda confirmed. "A house, a foundation, a family that works differently than other families, but works perfectly for us. I want to prove that love multiplies. When you share it, that having 4 parents makes me not confused, but blessed." The discussion that followed was intense and practical and full of the kind of details that make dreams into reality. Roger immediately began sketching modifications to Brenda's house plans, his construction expertise adding practical elements she hadn't considered. James started talking about medical equipment and regulatory requirements for the foundation. Margaret and Jody began planning holiday celebrations and family traditions that would incorporate everyone. By the time the sun set, they had the framework for something unprecedented, a family structure that honored all the relationships that had shaped Brenda, a foundation that would turn personal tragedy into public good, and a home that would Be big enough for all the love that had been waiting 30 years to be expressed. There's something else, Brenda said as they prepared to leave. I want to ask you all something, and I need you to be honest. They waited, watching her gather courage for whatever she was about to say. I've been alone for 30 years, afraid to love anyone completely because I was so terrified of being left. But watching you four today, seeing how you can love the same person without competing, how you can share joy without diminishing it, I think I'm ready to try again, to let someone in particular. Jody asked with a mother's instinct for affairs of the heart. Brenda blushed, looking suddenly like the daughter they'd all dreamed she'd become. His name is Michael, Dr. Michael Chen. We dated before, but I pushed him away because I was too scared to trust. He's been trying to win me back, and I think maybe it's time to let him. The room erupted in excited chatter. Four parents suddenly united in their desire to hear everything about this Michael, to plan how to meet him, to prepare for the possibility of more love entering their newly expanded family. And Brenda sat in the middle of it all, surrounded by more love than she'd ever dared dream of, finally ready to believe that some bonds are strong enough to survive anything. Even 30 years of separation, even the impossible circumstances that had torn them apart in the first place. Love, she realized, always finds a way home. And sometimes home is bigger and more complicated and more beautiful than you ever imagined it could be. Chapter 8. Love multiplied, not divided. 3 months after the reunion, the Hudson Washington Foundation for Children's Cardiac Care held its first board meeting in what had once been Brenda's lonely apartment and was now the temporary headquarters for their ambitious dream. The space buzzed with energy as 5 of the most important people in Brenda's life gathered around a conference table Roger had built himself, its surface covered with architectural plans, medical journals, and legal documents that would soon change countless lives. Dr. Michael Chen sat at Brenda's right hand, still somewhat overwhelmed by the whirlwind that his life had become since Brenda had called him 6 weeks ago and asked simply, "Are you willing to fall in love with a woman who comes with 4 parents and a dream to change the world?" Michael had known Brenda for 3 years, had been in love with her for 2.5 of them, and had spent the last year trying to convince her that her heart was safe with him. He'd never imagined that when she finally opened that heart, it would come with an entire extended family and a medical foundation. But as he watched her animated face as she presented their mission statement, he knew he'd never loved her more. A goal, Brenda was saying, her voice filled with the passion that had drawn Michael to her in the first place, is to ensure that no family ever faces the choice my parents had to make. Every child born with a cardiac defect should receive the best possible care, regardless of their family's financial situation. James Washington nodded approvingly, his medical expertise evident in the detailed questions he asked about surgical protocols and patient selection criteria. Margaret sat beside him, taking meticulous notes and occasionally asking pointed questions about logistics that showed she understood the complexity of what they were attempting. Roger and Jody sat across from them, and Michael was struck by how naturally they'd integrated into this professional setting, despite having no medical background. Roger's business acumen had proven invaluable in developing the foundation's financial structure, while Jody's experience with grief counseling had led to the innovative family support program that would be part of their services. The construction of the surgical center is ahead of schedule, Roger reported, consulting his notes. We should be ready for our first patients in 6 months, assuming the medical equipment arrives on time. It will, James assured him. I've pulled every favor owed to me in the medical device industry. We're getting state-of-the-art equipment at cost, and some manufacturers are donating items outright. Michael watched this exchange with amazement. In just 3 months, this unlikely family had created something extraordinary. The foundation would provide free cardiac surgery for children, comprehensive family support, and post-operative care that many paid facilities couldn't match. More than that, they'd found a way to turn their own pain into purpose, their own loss into hope for other families. "What about staffing?" Margaret asked, ever practical. "That's where Michael comes in," Brenda said, turning to smile at him with such warmth that his heart skipped a beat. "He's agreed to leave his position at Presbyterian to head up our pediatric cardiology program." The announcement was met with applause from the group, but Michael could see the question in their eyes, the same question he'd been asking himself for weeks. Was he making this sacrifice for the foundation, or for Brenda? The answer, he'd realized, was both. The foundation was revolutionary, the kind of work he'd dreamed of doing since medical school. But more than that, he was in love with the woman who had conceived it, and with the family that had embraced both the dream and him with equal fervor. "I have an announcement of my own," Michael said, his heart pounding as he reached into his jacket pocket. "I've been trying to find the right moment for this, but I've realized there's never going to be a perfect moment with this family. You all love too big and too loud for quiet moments." Brenda's eyes widened as he pulled out a small, velvet box, but before she could react, he was already on one knee beside her chair. "Brenda Hudson Washington," he said, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "You are the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. You're brilliant and compassionate and brave enough to open your heart to love, even after 30 years of feeling abandoned. You've shown me what true love looks like, the kind that grows when shared, the kind that creates families where none existed before, the kind that transforms pain into purpose." The room was absolutely silent, except for Jodi's soft crying and the sound of Margaret fumbling for tissues in her purse. "I love you," Michael continued, "but more than that, I love us. I love the life we could build together, the family we could create with all these people who already love you so completely. I love the foundation we could run together, the children we could save, the future we could build." He opened the box to reveal a ring that was both elegant and unusual, a vintage setting holding a diamond flanked by 2 smaller stones in different colors. "The center stone represents us," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "The blue stone represents your birth parents, and the green stone represents your adoptive parents. Because you don't have to choose between the people who love you, and neither do I. If you'll marry me, I want to marry all of it, you and them, and this beautiful, complicated, perfect family you've built." Brenda stared at the ring, tears streaming down her face, and for a moment Michael's heart stopped. Had he misread the situation? Had he moved too fast, assumed too much? Then she launched herself into his arms with such force that they both nearly toppled over, and she was kissing him and crying and laughing all at once. "Yes," she sobbed against his lips. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. But only if you're ready for what you're signing up for, because this family doesn't do anything halfway." The room erupted in celebration. Roger pumped Michael's hand and clapped him on the back so hard he nearly knocked him over. James offered medical advice about planning a wedding around surgical schedules. Margaret immediately began discussing venue options and guest lists. Jodi simply cried and held Brenda, whispering, "My baby's getting married," over and over again. But it was what happened next that showed Michael he truly understood what he was joining. Instead of stepping back to let the family celebrate, he pulled them all into the conversation. "I want to ask you something," he said, addressing Roger and Jodi directly. "I know traditionally a man asks the father for his daughter's hand in marriage, but Brenda has 4 parents, and I want all of your blessings." Roger's face crumpled with emotion. In 30 years of dreaming about his daughter's wedding, he'd never imagined being asked this question, never dared hope he'd have the right to. "Give this blessing," "Son," he said, his voice rough with tears, "you have not only my blessing but my gratitude. You're not just marrying our daughter, you're choosing to be part of this crazy, wonderful family we've built. That takes a special kind of man." "You have our blessing too," James added, speaking for himself and Margaret. "Brenda's happiness is all we've ever wanted, and you make her happier than we've ever seen her." "What about children?" Margaret asked, suddenly then blushed at her own boldness. "I mean, have you two discussed grandchildren?" Jody breathed, her eyes lighting up with possibility. "Oh my God, Roger, we could have grandchildren." Michael and Brenda looked at each other and burst into laughter at the naked hope on all four parental faces. "We've talked about it," Brenda admitted. "We want kids, at least 2, maybe 3, and they're going to be the luckiest children in the world because they're going to have 6 grandparents who love them beyond reason." "6?" James questioned. "Michael's parents," Brenda explained. "They're wonderful people who are going to love this family as much as we love each other. More love, not less. Always more love." The planning that followed was pure chaos and pure joy combined. They decided on a small ceremony at the Foundation's surgical center once it was completed. "Getting married, where we'll save children's lives together," as Brenda put it. They planned for Michael's parents to fly in from California, for James to walk Brenda down the aisle with Roger, for Jody and Margaret to serve as co-mothers of the bride. But the most touching moment came when Roger pulled Michael aside as the evening was winding down. "I want to give you something," he said, pressing a small wooden box into Michael's hands. "This was my father's wedding ring. He gave it to me when I married Jody, and I've been saving it for a son-in-law I never thought I'd have." Michael opened the box to find a simple gold band, worn smooth by decades of love and hard work. "I can't take this," he protested. "It's too precious." "That's exactly why you should take it," Roger replied. "You're marrying my daughter. You're becoming my son. This ring has been in our family for 3 generations, and I want it to continue." As Michael slipped the ring onto his finger, he felt the weight of more than just gold. He felt the weight of belonging, of being chosen, of becoming part of something bigger than himself. Later that night, as Brenda and Michael sat alone on the Foundation's future patient terrace looking out over the city lights, she curled up against his side and sighed contentedly. "Are you sure you know what you're getting into?" she asked, only half joking. 4 parents means 4 times the opinions about everything from wedding flowers to child-rearing techniques. "I'm getting exactly what I've always wanted," Michael replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "A woman I love beyond measure and a family that loves beyond reason. I'm getting you, healed and whole and ready to love completely. I'm getting the chance to spend my career saving children's lives and my evenings surrounded by people who understand that love isn't finite." "I love you," Brenda said simply, "not just for loving me, but for loving all of us, for understanding that when you marry me, you're not taking me away from my family. You're adding to it. Love grows when shared, not diminished," Michael agreed, echoing the philosophy that had become their family's guiding principle. As they sat together in the darkness, surrounded by the construction equipment that would soon become a place of healing, Brenda marveled at how much her life had changed in just a few months. She'd gone from being a lonely surgeon with a broken heart to being a woman surrounded by more love than she'd ever thought possible. She had parents who'd loved her enough to give her up and parents who'd loved her enough to raise her. She had a fiancé who wanted to marry not just her, but her entire complicated, beautiful family. She had a foundation that would turn her own pain into hope for other families. Most importantly, she finally understood that love isn't something you have to earn or prove you deserve. Love simply is, and when you're brave enough to accept it completely, it transforms everything it touches. Tomorrow, they would continue building the foundation. Next month, they would be married. Someday they would save their first child's life together, but tonight, surrounded by the love of 6 people who'd chosen to be her family, Brenda felt something she'd never experienced before. The deep, unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Chapter 9. A Wedding Like No Other. The Hudson Washington Foundation for Children's Cardiac Care had never looked more beautiful than it did on the morning of October 15th, exactly 31 years to the day after Brenda had been born and given up for adoption. What had been designed as a state-of-the-art medical facility had been transformed overnight into a wedding venue that perfectly embodied the unique love story it was hosting. The main surgical suite, not yet operational, had been converted into a chapel, its floor-to-ceiling windows flooding the space with golden autumn light. Instead of traditional church pews, Roger had built elegant wooden benches arranged in a circle, symbolizing the unbroken bond of family that had brought them all together. Each bench was adorned with white roses and baby's breath, but also with small framed photos of the moments that had led to this day. Pictures of baby Brenda in the NICU, of Roger and Jodie's wedding 31 years ago, of James and Margaret with toddler Brenda, of the family reunion in the hospital waiting room. "I can't believe we're doing this," Brenda whispered, staring at herself in the mirror of what would soon be the family consultation room, but was serving today as a bridal suite. Her reflection showed a woman transformed by love, not just romantic love, but the deep, abiding love of a family that had refused to let distance or time diminish their bond. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of sentiment and beauty. The base was a stunning ivory gown that Margaret had helped her choose, simple and elegant with clean lines that spoke to Brenda's practical nature. But it was the details that made it extraordinary. The veil had been made from pieces of the baby blanket that Roger and Jodie had wrapped her in 31 years ago, carefully restored and transformed by a seamstress who had wept when she heard the story. The bodice was embroidered with threads from Marie Washington's wedding dress, a gift from James, who wanted his late wife to be part of the ceremony. Around her neck, Brenda wore 2 lockets, one containing a photo of Roger and Jodie from their youth, the other holding a picture of James and Marie on their wedding day. "You look like an angel," Jodie said from behind her, and Brenda turned to see all 3 of her mothers standing in the doorway. Jodie wore a soft blue dress that complemented her still beautiful eyes. Margaret was elegant in lavender, and Dr. Lisa Chen, Michael's mother, glowed in deep green silk. The sight of them together, 3 women from completely different backgrounds, united by their love for her, made Brenda's heart overflow. "We have something for you," Margaret said, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. "Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, but with a twist that's uniquely ours." Jodie produced a small wooden jewelry box that Brenda recognized as the one from her childhood bedroom. "Something old," she said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold bracelet. "This was your birth grandmother's, Roger's mother. She died when he was young, but she left this for the daughter he would someday have. We've been saving it for 31 years. Margaret came forward next, holding a small wrapped package. "Something new," she said, as Brenda opened it to find a beautiful pair of pearl earrings. "These belong to Marie. She always said that if you ever got married, she wanted you to wear her pearls so she could be close to your heart." Lisa Chen, whom Brenda had met only a month ago, but who had embraced her with the warmth of a mother who understood that love creates family, held out a silk handkerchief embroidered with delicate flowers. "Something borrowed," she said with a gentle smile. "This was my mother's, Michael's grandmother. She brought it with her from China, and it's been carried by every bride in our family for 4 generations. Today, you become part of that tradition, and something blue all three women said together, each pulling out identical blue silk ribbons. One from each of us, to be braided into your bouquet. Blue for the something old we're giving you. Blue for the something new you're creating. Blue for the something borrowed that binds us all together. Brenda dissolved into tears, clutching the gifts to her chest. I don't deserve all of this love, she whispered. You don't deserve it, Jody said firmly, taking her daughter's face in her hands. You simply have it. Love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing and choosing again every single day, and every single day for 31 years, we've chosen to love you. Meanwhile, in what would soon be the administrative offices, Michael was experiencing his own emotional preparation. With his fathers, Roger, James, and Dr. William Chen stood around him as he adjusted his tie for the 20th time, each man representing a different aspect of the life he was about to fully embrace. Nervous? James asked with a gentle smile that had comforted Brenda through countless childhood fears and adolescent heartbreaks. Terrified, Michael admitted. Not about marrying Brenda. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. But about being worthy of all this. This family, this love, this responsibility. What if I'm not enough? Roger stepped forward and placed his hands on Michael's shoulders. Son, let me tell you something I learned 31 years ago. Love isn't about being enough. It's about being present. It's about showing up every day and choosing to love even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when you don't know how. Brenda doesn't need you to be perfect, William added, speaking with the wisdom of 35 years of marriage. She needs you to be honest, to be faithful, to be willing to grow alongside her. The fact that you're asking these questions tells me you're exactly the man she needs. James produced a small wooden box similar to the one Roger had given Michael months earlier. I have something for you too, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Marie wanted Brenda's husband to have this. Inside was a simple gold watch, elegant and timelessly masculine. She said that marriage is about time, the time you spend together, the time you invest in each other, the time you have to build a life. She wanted you to remember that every moment is precious. As Michael fastened the watch around his wrist, he felt the weight of joining something ancient and sacred. Not just a marriage, but a lineage of love that stretched back generations and would continue forward through the children he and Brenda would have. The ceremony itself was unlike anything any of the 50 guests had ever witnessed. Instead of traditional music, the processional began with a recording of Roger singing the lullaby he'd sung to baby Brenda in the NICU. His young voice crackling through speakers and bringing every person to tears before the bride even appeared. James and Roger walked down the aisle together first, both wearing dark suits with boutonnieres made from the same flowers that had been in Brenda's birth bouquet 31 years ago. They took their positions on either side of the altar, not giving the bride away, but welcoming the groom into their family. Margaret, Jody, and Lisa followed, walking together as the mothers of the bride and groom, their unity a testament to the way love multiplies rather than divides. They carried candles that they placed around the altar, symbolizing the light that family brings to life's most important moments. Then came Michael, walking alone but not lonely, his face radiant with joy and anticipation. He took his place between the two fathers who had raised Brenda, and together they waited for the woman who had brought them all together. When Brenda finally appeared, the entire gathering rose as one, but it wasn't just her beauty that took their breath away. It was the symbolism of the moment. She walked alone down the aisle, strong and independent, carrying a bouquet that combined white roses with baby's breath and those 3 blue ribbons braided through the stems. She was choosing this marriage not from need or desperation, but from wholeness and strength. Halfway down the aisle, she paused at the bench where her adoptive and birth grandparents would have sat if they'd lived to see this day. She placed a single white rose on the bench and whispered, "Thank you for the love that brought us here." When she reached the altar, instead of being given away, she took hands with both Michael and her fathers, creating a circle that included everyone who had shaped her life. The officiant, a family friend who was also a pediatric nurse, began the ceremony with words that perfectly captured the unique nature of this union. "We gather today not just to witness the marriage of Brenda and Michael, but to celebrate the power of love, to create family where none existed, to heal wounds that seemed unhealable, to prove that some bonds are stronger than time, distance, or circumstance." The vows they exchanged were both deeply personal and universally moving. Michael spoke of falling in love not just with Brenda, but with the family that had shaped her, with the foundation they would build together, with the legacy of love they would create. Brenda's vows were addressed not just to Michael, but to her entire family. "Michael, I promise to love you with the same fierce devotion that brought my parents back to me. I promise to build our marriage on the foundation of love that survives anything, the love that endures separation, the love that chooses sacrifice, the love that never gives up hope. I promise to be your wife, but also to remain the daughter, the sister, the friend that love has made me." The ring ceremony included all 6 parents, each placing their hands over the couples as the rings were exchanged, blessing the marriage and welcoming both bride and groom into their expanded family. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss was witnessed not just by their guests, but by the spirits of all those who had loved them into this moment. Marie Washington, whose love had raised Brenda, Roger's parents, whose sacrifice had shaped his character, all the unnamed individuals whose choices had led to this perfect convergence of souls. The celebration that followed was held in the Foundation's future family waiting room, transformed into a reception hall that buzzed with joy and laughter, and the kind of conversation that happens when people who love deeply come together to celebrate love's triumph. During the father-daughter dance, Brenda danced first with Roger, then with James, then insisted that Michael dance with Jody, Margaret, and Lisa in turn. "No one gets left out," she declared. "Not today, not ever." The evening's most touching moment came when Roger stood to give a toast, his construction worker's hands shaking as he held his champagne glass. 31 years ago," he began, his voice carrying across the room, "Jody and I made the hardest decision of our lives. We gave up our daughter to save her. Tonight, I understand that we didn't lose a daughter. We planted love that has grown into this beautiful family, this foundation that will save other children, this proof that love always finds its way home." He raised his glass to Brenda and Michael, his eyes bright with tears and pride. "To my daughter, who came back to save my life in more ways than one. To my new son, who chose to love not just her but all of us. And to love itself, which never abandons, never forgets, and always, always finds its way home." As glasses clinked and tears flowed and laughter filled the air, Brenda looked around at the faces surrounding her. 6 parents, 1 husband, friends, who had become family, and the promise of children yet to come, who would be raised in this abundance of love. For the first time in her life, Dr. Brenda Hudson Washington Chen felt completely, utterly, perfectly complete. Chapter 10. The Circle of Love Eternal. 2 years and 3 months after their wedding, on a snowy December morning that transformed the world into a crystalline wonderland, Dr. Brenda Hudson Washington Chen stood at the window of her private room at the very hospital where she'd first saved her father's life. But today, she wasn't the surgeon. She was the patient cradling not 1, but 2 perfect miracles against her chest. Roger James Chen had arrived first, screaming his displeasure at being disturbed from his warm, comfortable home inside his mother's womb. He was followed 12 minutes later by his sister, Jody Marie Chen, who entered the world with the quiet dignity that would characterize her entire personality. Twins, born healthy and perfect, with their father's gentle eyes and their mother's determined chin and hearts that beat strong and steady without need of surgical intervention. The room was controlled chaos in the most beautiful way. 6 grandparents moved around the space like planets in orbit, each taking turns holding the babies, each whispering promises and blessings and the kind of love that creates legends. Roger Hudson, now 53, and grayer but stronger than ever since his heart attack, held his grandson with the reverence of a man who had waited over 3 decades to experience this moment. "Hello there, little man," he whispered to Roger James, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I'm your Grandpa Roger. I have so many stories to tell you about your mama, about love that never gives up, about families that love so big they break all the rules." Across the room, Jody held Jody Marie with the wonder of a woman who had never dared dream she would be called Grandma. At 52, she was radiant with joy, her eyes bright with tears that seemed to wash away 33 years of heartbreak in a single moment. "My precious girl," she cooed to her granddaughter, "you're named after me, but I hope you'll be so much braver than I ever was. I hope you'll never doubt for even 1 second how deeply you're loved." James Washington, distinguished and elegant, at 68, took his turn with the babies with the practiced ease of a man who had delivered hundreds of children, but had never experienced the particular joy of holding his own grandchildren. Margaret, 70 and still beautiful, glowed with happiness as she helped arrange the blankets and fussed over details with the loving attention that grandmothers have perfected across generations. Michael's parents, William and Lisa Chen, completed the circle of grandparents, their joy made even more profound by the fact that they'd never expected to have such an extended family. They'd come from California expecting to welcome grandchildren and had instead found themselves embraced by a love story that had transformed everyone it touched. "Look at this," Lisa marveled, watching the 6 adults pass the baby's back, and forth with the fluid choreography of people who had learned to share love without diminishing it. 6 grandparents, and not one moment of jealousy or competition. Just pure love multiplied by 6. Michael stood beside Brenda's hospital bed, his hand in hers, watching his children be welcomed into the world by more love than most people experience in a lifetime. As a pediatric cardiologist, he'd seen hundreds of families navigate the joy and terror of new parenthood, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Seeing his own children surrounded by grandparents who understood that love creates abundance, not scarcity. "How do you feel?" he asked Brenda softly, brushing her hair back from her face with the tenderness that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. "Complete," she replied, her voice thick with exhaustion and overwhelming emotion. "For the first time in my entire life, I feel completely, perfectly complete." The next few hours were a blur of visitors and phone calls and the kind of celebration that happens when a family that has been through hell together finally experiences pure joy. The nurses at the hospital, many of whom knew Brenda's story, stopped by to congratulate the family and marvel at the sight of 6 grandparents who had somehow figured out how to love without boundaries. But it was that evening, when visiting hours were over and the room had finally quieted, that the most profound moment occurred. The 6 grandparents sat in chairs arranged around Brenda's bed, each holding a baby or simply watching in wonder, when Roger pulled out his phone and began to play a recording. It was the lullaby, the same melody Roger had sung to baby Brenda 33 years ago in the NICU. The same song that had somehow etched itself into her soul and remained with her through decades of separation. But now, instead of one voice, there were 6 voices joining in harmony, all the grandparents singing together to welcome the newest members of their extraordinary family into the world. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word. Grandpa's gonna buy you a mockingbird, and if that mockingbird won't sing, Grandma's gonna buy you a diamond ring." As the lullaby continued, With each grandparent taking a verse and adding their own promises of love and protection, Brenda felt something shift inside her chest. The hole that had defined her for 30 years, the ache of separation, the fear of abandonment, the uncertainty about her place in the world, finally completely healed. These babies would never know that feeling, she realized. They would never wonder if they were loved, never question their worth, never fear that the people who mattered most might leave them. They were being born into a family that had already proven love could survive anything: separation, time, impossible circumstances, even death itself. "Tell me the story," Roger James seemed to demand with his infant fussing, and as if understanding his request, Roger Hudson began to speak. "Once upon a time," he said, his voice soft in the dimmed hospital room, "there was a young man and woman who loved each other very much, but who weren't old enough or rich enough to take care of a precious baby who needed special help. So they made the hardest choice in the world, and they gave their baby to people who could love her and help her grow strong." Jody picked up the story, her voice joining her husband's in the rhythm of the fairy tale they were creating for their grandchildren. "The baby grew up to be brilliant and beautiful and brave, and she became a doctor who saved children's lives. But she always felt like something was missing, like part of her heart was somewhere else. Then, one day," James continued, understanding that this story belonged to all of them, "the young man, who wasn't young anymore, got very sick, and guess who was the doctor who saved his life? The very same baby girl they had given up so many years before. And when they found each other again," Margaret added, her voice warm with the wonder of it all, "they discovered that love never really leaves. It just waits, sometimes for 30 years, for the right moment to bring everyone home." The babies had fallen asleep during the story, but the adults continued talking, sharing memories and dreams and hopes for the future. They talked about the foundation, which had already saved 12 children's lives and was expanding to include 3 more surgical centers. They talked about the house they were building together, designed to accommodate 3 generations, and the inevitable chaos of holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday dinners. Most importantly, they talked about the legacy they were creating, not just for Roger James and Jody Marie, but for all the children who would be saved by the foundation, all the families who would be kept together because love had found a way to multiply rather than divide. "Do you think they'll understand?" Brenda asked, looking down at her sleeping children. "When they're older, do you think they'll understand how extraordinary this is? Having 6 grandparents who love them, growing up in a family that was built by miracles." "They'll take it for granted," William said with a smile. "And that's exactly as it should be. They'll assume that every family loves this deeply, that every child is this wanted, that every story has this kind of happy ending. And maybe by the time they're adults, they'll be right." As the night wore on and the grandparents reluctantly began to leave, though none wanted to be the first to go, Brenda found herself alone with Michael and their sleeping children for the first time since they'd been born. "Are you ready for this?" Michael asked, gesturing to the babies and by extension to the life they were embarking on together. "I've been ready for 33 years, Brenda replied. "I just didn't know it." She looked down at Roger James and Jody Marie, perfect and peaceful in their sleep, and made them the same promise her birth parents had made to her in a different hospital room more than 3 decades ago: to love them more than her own life, to protect them always, to make sure they never doubted their worth or their place in the world. But unlike Roger and Jody 33 years ago, Brenda wouldn't have to choose between love and life, between keeping her children and saving them. These babies would grow up surrounded by abundance, not just material abundance, though the foundation's success had ensured they'd never want for anything, but the abundance that comes from being part of a love story that had proven nothing could break it. The next morning, as Brenda prepared to take her children home, to the house where 6 grandparents waited to spoil them, absolutely, she took one last look around the hospital room where her new life had truly begun. On the windowsill sat a bouquet of flowers with a card signed by the entire cardiac surgical team. To the doctor who taught us that some operations heal more than hearts, they heal souls. As they left the hospital, Michael carrying Roger James, while Brenda held Jodie Marie, they were met by a sight that took their breath away. In the parking lot, all 6 grandparents waited with cars decorated with balloons and signs reading "Welcome Home" and "Love Multiplied by 6. Nurses and doctors waved from windows, and several families, whose children had been saved by the foundation, had come to witness the homecoming of the babies who represented hope made manifest. But it was the banner stretched between 2 cars that made Brenda cry all over again. Some love stories take 33 years to write. This one was worth the wait. As they drove home together, a caravan of cars filled with grandparents and gifts and enough love to power a small city, Brenda realized that her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. She was no longer the abandoned baby, the searching, her daughter, the lonely surgeon. She was the wife, the mother, the bridge between past and future, the proof that love always finds its way home. And as Roger James and Jodie Marie slept peacefully in their car seats, surrounded by the voices of 6 grandparents planning their futures with the confidence of people who had learned that love conquers everything, Brenda understood the most beautiful truth of all. Some circles of love are so perfect, so complete, that they expand to include anyone brave enough to step inside. Their love story had taken 33 years to write, but it would last for generations, rippling outward through every child they saved, every family they kept together, every person who witnessed their proof that love multiplied, never divided, always found its way home. And in the end, that was the greatest surgery of all. The healing of hearts that had been broken by separation, the miracle of love that refused to give up, the beautiful, impossible truth that some bonds are stronger than time, distance, or even death itself. Love always wins. Love always finds a way. Love always comes home.